Welcome to Talk Wave, making waves, one talk at a time.
Pacific Palisades. It's like picture perfect, right? Beautiful homes, ocean views, the California dream. But the Palisades fire, it turned that dream into a nightmare. And it's even more tragic when you realize that many homeowners were already facing another challenge. Even before the fire, their insurance companies, they were dropping their policies.
It really was a double blow for those families, and sadly, it's something we're seeing more and more as climate change makes these events like wildfires even more intense and frequent.
Yeah, it's terrifying, really. I mean, just before the fire, State Farm dropped something like 1,600 policies in Pacific Palisades alone.
Wow.
And this is on top of thousands of policies that were dropped in other, wealthy areas around Los Angeles, like Brentwood and Calabasas. Can you imagine? You're dealing with the stress of losing your insurance, and then, boom, the fire hits, and you lose your home.
It's devastating. It shows just how vulnerable these communities are becoming, facing, these compounding problems. On the one hand, there's the increasing risk of these climate-related disasters, and on the other, you have the insurance industry pulling back, making it harder and harder for people to protect themselves financially.
So what happens to these homeowners who can't get coverage from their, traditional insurers? What options do they have?
Well, a lot of times they're forced to turn to the state-backed FAIR plan. It's basically the insurer of last resort.
Ah, okay. But it's not like a perfect solution.
Right. There are definitely downsides.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it's usually a lot more expensive than a regular insurance policy.
Oh, I see.
And the coverage might be more limited, too. It's really meant to be a temporary safety net, not something you rely on long term.
And we're seeing more and more people needing that safety net, aren't we?
Absolutely. If you look at Pacific Palisades, for example, between 2020 and 2024, enrollment in the FAIR plan, it quadrupled. That means that before the fire even happened, something like 1 in 7 homeowners were already relying on the FAIR plan for their insurance.
1 in 7, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So what's causing this exodus from traditional insurance? Is it all about climate change, or are there other things at play here?
Climate change is a huge factor, definitely. As we see more and more disasters and they become more severe, insurers, their costs are going up, and they're getting more and more wary of covering homes in these areas they consider high risk. But it's not just about the risk itself.
It's not.
No. There's also the issue of the value of the homes.
Ah, right.
In Pacific Palisades, the median home value is over $3 million. So when a fire rips through a neighborhood like that, the potential payouts for the insurance companies, they're enormous.
So you're saying the stakes are even higher for insurers in these, affluent areas?
Exactly. And that can make them even less likely to want to provide coverage. It's a complicated situation, but at the end of the day, it comes down to managing risk for these companies, making sure they stay financially solvent.
It's a tough spot for everyone involved.
Yeah.
You have homeowners facing the very real possibility of losing everything. And you have these insurance companies trying to balance their responsibility to their policyholders with the need to, protect their own bottom line.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act for sure. And the thing is, as we'll talk about more, this tension, it's creating these ripple effects that could extend way beyond the insurance industry itself.
Yeah, it's tough to think about what happens next. If insurance becomes too expensive or even impossible to get, what does that mean for these communities, for the people who live there?
That's the big question. And it's something that policymakers, industry leaders, they're all struggling with right now. The potential consequences, they're huge. If you can't get insurance, well, first of all, it's going to be really hard to get a mortgage.
Right.
Property values could just plummet. And you could see people, they're forced to just abandon their homes. They can't rebuild, they can't sell.
It's like this domino effect, right? One thing leads to another, and suddenly you've got a full-blown crisis.
Exactly. And this isn't just happening in California either. You see the same trends in other parts of the country, places that are vulnerable to climate disasters. Florida, Louisiana, Texas, they're all seeing insurance companies not renew policies, and premiums, they're going through the roof.
It's scary to think about. You buy a house, you put your life savings into it, you build a future for your family, and then, through no fault of your own, you could lose it all because the insurance industry decides your community is too risky.
It's a harsh reality, and it's part of this bigger issue of climate justice.
Yeah.
The people who are least responsible for climate change are often the ones who are hit the hardest by its impacts. And that's not just homeowners. It's renters, businesses, whole communities.
So what can we do? What are some of the solutions to this insurance crisis?
Well, there are a few different approaches being looked at. Some policymakers, they're pushing for the government to get more involved in the insurance market.
Okay.
For example, there's been talk about expanding the National Flood Insurance Program so it covers other types of disasters too, like wildfires.
But wouldn't that be a huge financial burden on the government?
It would be expensive, yeah, for sure. But the argument is that the cost of doing nothing, of not acting, that's even greater. When disasters hit and people aren't insured, well, a lot of times the government ends up paying for the disaster relief and the recovery efforts anyway.
That makes sense. So more government intervention, that's one option. What else is being considered?
Another approach is to focus on, like, mitigating risk.
Okay.
So things like making building codes stronger, investing in fire-resistant materials, creating defensible spaces around homes.
So basically making homes and communities more resilient to climate change.
Exactly. And there are also some interesting new insurance solutions being developed, like parametric insurance.
Parametric insurance? That's a new one.
Yeah, so with parametric insurance, it pays out based on how severe an event is, like a hurricane or a wildfire, rather than the actual damage that's done to your property.
Interesting. It sounds like there are a lot of ideas out there. But is there any one solution that's going to completely solve this problem?
Honestly, it's probably going to take a combination of approaches. There's no magic bullet. We have to be thinking long-term, investing in both mitigating the risks and adapting to them. And we need to remember that climate change is a global issue. We need global cooperation to solve it.
It's a big challenge. But it sounds like there's at least some reason for hope. People are taking this issue seriously and exploring different solutions.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasize that, while the situation is serious, it's not hopeless. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, we can address this crisis. What we need now is the political will and the collective action to make it happen.
It's a call to action then, not just for policymakers, but for all of us.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in building a more resilient future. Whether it's advocating for policy changes, making our own homes more fire safe, or supporting organizations that are working on climate solutions, we can all make a difference.
You're right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this problem. But even small actions can add up to create real change.
And we owe it to ourselves, to future generations, and to those who have already lost so much to climate change to keep pushing for solutions.
Speaking of those who have lost so much, let's go back to the homeowners in Pacific Palisades. What advice would you give them as they try to navigate this incredibly difficult situation?
It's hard to offer advice when people are dealing with such devastating losses. I think the first thing is just to acknowledge the emotional toll this kind of event takes. The trauma of the fire itself, the grief of losing your home, your possessions, and then on top of that, the stress and uncertainty of dealing with insurance companies. It's a lot to process.
Absolutely. It's hard to even imagine what they're going through.
It really is. And it's hard not to feel a sense of urgency when you hear these stories. It really brings home the fact that climate change, it's not some far-off problem. It's impacting people's lives right now. And the consequences, they can be devastating.
It's true. And this whole issue with insurance, it's just one example of the challenges we're going to face more and more as climate risks increase. It makes you think about some really fundamental questions.
Like, yeah, who's ultimately responsible for bearing the costs of climate change? And how do we make sure that everyone has access to insurance? Insurance they can actually afford, no matter where they live or what kind of risks they face.
Right. And those are exactly the kind of questions we need to be talking about.
Yeah.
If climate change keeps making certain areas riskier and riskier to insure, how do we balance individual responsibility with, societal support? How do we create a system that's fair but also sustainable?
Tough questions. And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers. But it's a conversation we can't afford to avoid. And it's not just a California thing. It's something communities all over the country, all over the world need to be grappling with.
For sure. One thing I'm taking away from all of this is we can't just react to these disasters after they happen. We need to be more proactive, thinking about how to reduce the risks in the first place, investing in infrastructure that can withstand these events, coming up with innovative solutions.
Absolutely. It's about shifting our whole mindset from crisis response to long-term resilience.
Exactly. And it requires us to think bigger, about how we build our communities, how we manage resources, how we protect the people who are most vulnerable to these climate impacts.
It does.
It can all feel so overwhelming, Where do we even begin?
Yeah. I get that. It's a huge challenge. But I think the most important thing is to focus on what we can control. We can push for policy changes at the local level, the state level, even the national level. We can make our own homes and businesses more resilient, taking steps to protect them from things like fire or floods. We can support the organizations that are working on climate solutions. And honestly, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just talk about it, have these conversations with our friends and families, our communities.
That's a good point. Sometimes it's easy to forget that even small actions can make a difference, especially when we all work together.
I think so too. At the end of the day, it's about recognizing that we're all connected. What happens in one part of the world, it affects us all. We have a shared responsibility to build a future that's both sustainable and equitable.
Absolutely. So for everyone listening out there, if there was one thing you could challenge them to do after hearing all of this, what would it be?
I'd challenge them to think about the role they can play in building that more resilient future we've been talking about. It doesn't have to be something huge. It could be as simple as having a conversation with a friend about climate change, or, looking into ways to make your own home more fire safe, or even just contacting your elected officials and letting them know that these issues matter to you. Every action, even the small ones, they all contribute to the solution.
It's a good reminder that we all have a voice, we all have the power to make a difference. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been I don't know, I guess a sobering conversation, but also hopeful in a way. We hope that it's inspired you to learn more, to get involved, to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.